What's good? It's Woog. Oh boy, so this is a little bit complicated. Sources say, and Mike Coppinger of ESPN reports, that Errol Spence Jr., the holder of the WBC, WBA, and IBF welterweight belts, is about to fight Keith Thurman in April, which is what a lot of us were suspecting was going to be the case. After the negotiations towards the end of last year were, to put it mildly, disrupted by Terrence Crawford basically taking the BLK prime money to fight David Avanesian in December, to everybody's dismay, right? That had us all saying no, and then Terrence Crawford came on and explained his side of the story on video, but it basically disrupted Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford and the long negotiations that were underway. And, there were things that Terrence Crawford wanted a certain way, more transparency, all of that stuff, right? Well, after Terrence Crawford then took the fight against Avanesian, we thought, and the WBC basically ordered Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman. But this fight between Spence and Thurman isn't even going to be for Errol Spence's welterweight belts. This is going to take place up at 154, which Errol Spence nor Keith Thurman have fought at 154. Errol Spence has been a big welterweight for his whole career, and I thought years ago that it was only a matter of time before he went to 154. Now the question is this going to be a one-off at 154 where his stablemate, both trained by Derek James, my trainer of the year for 2022, Errol Spence's stablemate, Jermell Charlo, is holding all of the belts at 154. So that makes things interesting. So I suspect that Errol Spence is going to come back to 147, but the way that this works politically is that, let's say Errol Spence gets past Keith Thurman. That's an if. And a lot of people are just rolling with that assumption because of Keith Thurman's inactivity. I mean, more so than his age. On paper, he's not super old, but it's just the fact that, it's been a year since he fought Mario Barrios. It was 2.5 years between the Barrios fight and 2019 when he fought Manny Pacquiao. And then before the Josecito Lopez fight, right before the Pacquiao fight, it was another 2 years of inactivity between the Lopez fight and the Danny Garcia fight. And it's the Danny Garcia fight that we see as being the last of Keith Thurman being in his absolute prime. I swear, Keith Thurman was on top of the world after those back-to-back wins versus Sean Porter and Danny Garcia. But a lot of people are assuming that Errol Spence is going to get past Keith Thurman. So if he does, the WBA, one of the three sanctioning bodies of the belts that Errol Spence holds, they are giving Errol Spence 60 days to negotiate and to finalize a deal versus Terrence Crawford for all of the belts. That is the mandate and the timeline that the WBA is going to give to Errol Spence Jr., which, that's music to my ears. I just want to see them circle back as soon as this Spence versus Thurman fight, assuming Spence wins and is uninjured, which is another question. I'm going to go back to that. But if Spence gets past Keith Thurman, I want them to go right back to the negotiating table and finalize the fight, the best fight that could be made in all of boxing, in my opinion, Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford. Now, if Errol Spence doesn't comply with that 60-day timeline to finalize him versus Crawford, then he has to defend his 147-pound titles against the WBA regular title fight winner between Iammontis Stanionis and Virgil Ortiz Jr. So I'm going to repeat that. If Errol Spence gets past Keith Thurman and is unable or unwilling to finalize a deal versus Terrence Crawford within 60 days, that doesn't mean the fight has to take place in 60 days. They just have to pick a date within 60 days. Then Errol Spence, if he wants to keep his 147-pound belts, is going to have to fight the Stanionis versus Virgil Ortiz Jr. winner. So the options are getting fewer for Errol Spence if he wants to remain a welterweight champion. And to me, that's really a lot of leeway. Look, Errol Spence Jr. has had 3 major setbacks over the past couple of years. After he had beaten Sean Porter to capture the WBC belt to go along with his IBF belt that he won from Kell Brook, he beat Sean Porter in September of 2019. Very close and competitive fight. Then he gets into that devastating accident where he was drunk driving, speeding in his drop top. He was launched from his car, and ironically, not having a seatbelt on might have saved his life. So that was a huge physical setback. It's a minor miracle that he wasn't terribly injured or dead from that accident. So then he comes back like a year and 3 months later and beats Danny Garcia via unanimous decision. So then after the Garcia fight, they schedule, and the Garcia fight was in December of the first COVID year, 2020, December of 2020. And then he's scheduled to fight Manny Pacquiao in the middle of 2021. And then it turns out he's got a retina tear in his eye. He needs emergency eye surgery. That's another potentially career-threatening injury. So he's got the first car accident, he's got the eye tear, then they canceled that Errol Spence versus Pacquiao fight, which I was just, that was crushing, that cancellation, because this is before, Yordenis Ugas would eventually step in and beat Pacquiao. But we didn't know at the time that Ugas could beat Pacquiao. Pacquiao, in his last fight, had just beaten Keith Thurman. So that was supposed to be the fight that, if Errol Spence was to beat Pacquiao, would launch him into superstardom, because Manny Pacquiao is a mega star. And Errol Spence, for as good as he is, isn't really known outside of the boxing community, which is the plight of a lot of elite boxers these days and in recent years. So, devastating cancellation. Another devastating injury for Errol Spence Jr. keeps him out of the ring for a while. Almost another whole year. And it's not until April of 2022 that Errol Spence returns to the ring to fight Yordenis Ugas. And he stops Ugas in the 10th round. Very good fight. Very good performance. One of the performances of the year, in my opinion. Errol Spence stopped Ugas in the 10th. Captured the WBA belt, so now he's a WBC, IBF, and WBA champion. And then in December, just last month, he gets in a head-on collision. I swear, he's got some of the worst luck, or the best luck if you count that first car accident, and coming away from that alive and with your body in one piece, intact. But he's got this head-on collision where somebody like a 14-year-old, underage, unlicensed driver runs a red light, smashes into Errol Spence. He's able to get on video and tell, his Instagram, I think it was Instagram followers about what just happened. He was talking about hurting his leg in that accident. So I'm thinking that leg injury, which he has since commented again about, I'm thinking that's not really being heavily considered when people are talking Spence versus Thurman. Now we've got 3 serious incidents, we'll say, either devastating accidents, eye injury, or just another really bad car accident where you walk away from it with a banged up leg. At what point do these occurrences catch up with Errol Spence Jr.? I swear, this guy is seemingly unbreakable. And then he keeps on returning to the ring and having outstanding, or at least very, I would say, still excellent performances. Even the decision win against Danny Garcia was a demonstrative decision win. But I'm just thinking, unless you're a cat, you don't have 9 lives. And so I'm really praying for Errol Spence that these incidents are less frequent as he goes forward with his life. And I'm not blaming that second car accident on him. The first accident, yes, that was on him, but not the second accident. The second one seems like it was a very unfortunate incident where, again, he's got this bulletproof SUV. He's lucky to come out of that relatively unscathed. But again, we don't know how bad the injuries that he might have sustained are and how they might affect his performance in this upcoming fight against Keith Thurman. But yeah, this is a very complicated situation with Spence and Thurman because, Keith Thurman, around the time he beat Danny Garcia, again, he had those back-to-back wins against Sean Porter and Danny Garcia. He was undefeated, 28-0 at the time. He's a unified champion. So at this point, he's got the WBC and WBA welterweight belts. And then he doesn't return to the ring for almost 2 years because of injuries, nagging injuries that kept him out of the ring. And then he came back against Josecito Lopez, won a close majority decision where Keith Thurman at one point in that fight in the middle rounds was kind of out on his feet against Josecito Lopez. I don't know how Keith Thurman made it out of that round, like as messed up as he was. Go rewatch that round against Lopez. He could barely defend himself, and he was just taking more punches, and his head was just snapping back. It was looking all bad momentarily for Keith Thurman. But he did come out of that fight with the close win, and then he lost to Manny Pacquiao. Still to this day, Keith Thurman's only loss. And that was via split decision in July of 2019. And then he came back and fought a 140-pounder who was coming up to 147, Mario Barrios, the same Barrios that Gervonta Davis stopped. I find it very interesting that Davis, a 130/135-pounder, stopped Mario Barrios at 140, and Keith Thurman, a welterweight, couldn't stop the 140-pounder coming up to 147, Mario Barrios. I find that very interesting and very telling about how devastating Gervonta Davis's punching power really is, because once upon a time, Keith Thurman had the reputation of being a knockout artist. Like, he stopped Diego Chavez in a very meaningful fight at the time. Diego Chavez was surging. Keith Thurman was surging. So this was like a hot prospect versus hot prospect for like a WBA interim belt at the time. Very consequential fight. And Keith Thurman stopped Diego Chavez. He also stopped Luis Collazo. He beat Robert the Ghost Guerrero and Leonard Bundu via decision. He also stopped the once dangerous Jesus Soto Caras. He stopped him in the 9th round. So yeah, Keith Thurman packs a punch. But the question about Keith Thurman has been in recent years, is he even nearly as hungry as he used to be? He picked up and developed so many interests, developed a family life, just a life outside of boxing. Very interesting guy. And he still makes for a very interesting interview. But it just doesn't seem like he is as dug in as he was when he seemed singularly focused on boxing and just dead set on being the best that he could be. He truly seems like at one point and for a long time in his career, he just wanted to be the best fighter in the world. Like, there was no denying that that's how Keith Thurman felt earlier in his career. We just haven't been getting that same energy from Keith Thurman since after the Danny Garcia fight. It must have been very disheartening for those nagging injuries to have kept him out of the ring for nearly 2 years. And quite frankly, again, we have not seen, in my view, the best of Keith Thurman, like prime Keith Thurman, since March of 2017. That is about 6 years ago. But I do think that Keith Thurman is still a very good boxer puncher, still a good fighter, and quite frankly, Spence versus Thurman does feel like unfinished business. It does. It's almost one of the last boxes that Errol Spence kind of needs to check before saying that he's done with the welterweight division. Like, I don't think Spence has to fight Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz. Like, if he handles business, he does have to fight Terrence Crawford. And then outside of Crawford, Keith Thurman is kind of the next guy that I feel he has to fight, just because Keith Thurman is kind of seen to be the last era's welterweight elite. This is when Keith Thurman and probably Kell Brook were the best welterweights in what I like to call the post-Mayweather Manny Pacquiao era. And yes, Manny Pacquiao was still somewhat active and was still performing well when he would return to the ring, but the new class was led by Kell Brook after he beat Sean Porter, and then Keith Thurman after he had emerged, beating Robert the Ghost Guerrero, then beating Sean Porter and Danny Garcia. I mean, I'll put it like this. At the time Keith Thurman beat Danny Garcia, after beating Sean Porter, then beat Danny Garcia, we're talking March 2017, Errol Spence was 2 months away from fighting and challenging Kell Brook for his IBF belt. So Errol Spence wasn't even a champion at the time that we last saw the best of Keith Thurman against Danny Garcia. Errol Spence's best wins at that time were against Leonard Bundu and Chris Algieri. So he was just emerging. And the hard feelings that Errol Spence seems to still harbor from Keith Thurman not giving him a shot when Keith Thurman was a champion and Errol Spence was on the upswing, that is one of the biggest reasons that Errol Spence cites for not having fought Keith Thurman yet at this point. And a part of me thinks that that also plays into why this fight is at 154. Basically saying, I'll give you the check. You'll make the money from fighting Errol Spence, but I'm not going to give you the welterweight title shots. And that's just my assumption and conjecture there. I have nothing to really base that on other than what I've read and what I've heard both of these guys say over the years. But yeah, look, this isn't a bad fight. Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman. It's just not the fight we wanted. We all want Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford. And with this fight against Thurman, not only are you risking injury, losing the fight perhaps, but yeah, you're risking injury. Like you could win the fight, but have a broken hand or a bad cut that needs to heal. So those are the initial risks. But also the fact that big welterweight Errol Spence is now going to be fighting at 154. He's going to be weighing in at 154. There's no guarantee that he could just shrink back down to 147 and perform at his absolute best against Terrence Crawford. So yeah, I'm going to do a proper preview of Spence versus Thurman. Yes, Errol Spence should be a sizable favorite here, but if this was prime versus prime, I would kind of like who is the better boxer between the two? They were both. Keith Thurman was a very sharp boxer in his prime. So I would have loved to have seen these guys prime versus prime. But since we're not getting prime versus prime, you would have to heavily favor Errol Spence Jr. here. And Keith Thurman is also notoriously vulnerable to the body. We saw him get hurt against Manny Pacquiao to the body. He got hurt against Mario Barrios to the body. He got hurt against Luis Colasso badly to the body. And Errol Spence is one of the best body punchers in all of boxing. And he's such an intelligent jabber and just sweet science / patient hunter type of fighter. Like, this could be very bad for Keith Thurman, but we'll see what he brings. And again, I'm going to do a proper preview as we near the fight date, but there's just all types of risk. And it would almost require a perfect scenario for Errol Spence, meaning he beats Keith Thurman and comes out of the fight relatively uninjured for them to then be able to circle back and make Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford before Terrence Crawford turns 36 years old, because that's my concern. I do not want to see Terrence Crawford have to enter the ring against Errol Spence Jr. at 36 years old. Yes, Terrence Crawford keeps himself in absolute good condition. He takes care of his body. He doesn't heavily abuse his body with substances. But, the writing is on the wall. Terrence Crawford is going to turn 36 in September. So I really want this fight, if it's going to be made between Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, I just want it to happen when Terrence Crawford is still, we're already playing with fire at 35 years old, but I sure as hell don't want him to be 36 years old when he's fighting basically the fight of his life. But yeah, let me know what you think about Errol Spence Jr. versus Keith Thurman. Not yet official, but reportedly being finalized. Let me know what you think in the comments. Does Keith Thurman have a chance here? And if he does, what would that chance be based on? Like, he's no longer one-time Thurman where he just has to hit you once and you could potentially be out. He doesn't seem to still be that explosive. Can he sweet science his way and move and jab and counter? Can he win that type of a fight round over round against Errol Spence Jr.? Yeah, please let me know what you think about this in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.